as Christians, we haven't done a great job all the time of catechizing and explaining the what and the why of freedom of speech. And we need to change that. We need to change that today. We need to reclaim freedom of speech. And that begins with a right understanding of human nature. We're made in God's image. And what does that mean? It means we were made to seek and to speak the truth. As rational agents made in God's image, He endowed us with creativity, with speech, with the ability to engage in rational conversation. And we use those gifts to worship God. We use those gifts to proclaim truth, and we use those gifts to fulfill the Great Commission. That means that speech is integral to our nature and to our purpose. But what that doesn't mean is that speech is a cover for evil. That's the great lie that's been spread by modern society, that freedom of speech is simply code for bigotry and hatred. But that's simply not true. As the great Christian philosopher and theologian Carl F.H. Henry said, what moderns call human rights are the contingent flip side of divine duties. Our speech is ultimately measured by whether it honors God and advances the truth. Now, in this imperfect world, of course, our understanding is limited. As Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. And so we must engage in conversation, debate, and yes, sometimes even conflict to get to the truth. And that's why our framers of the Constitution wrote the First Amendment. They wrote that to constrain the government's power to dictate orthodoxy, to bind our conscience, and to establish truth for everyone. And why is that important? It's important because right now, truth always meets opposition. Do you feel that in your life today? Truth collides with error. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul told the disciples in Corinth, he was beaten, he was stoned, he was persecuted constantly, all for spreading the gospel. And much like in Roman times, those things happen even today. And how do they happen? Usually at the hands of government. Government trying to push back against voices that oppose its orthodoxy. Take, for example, Pastor Wang Yi in China. He is serving a 9-year sentence today. Why? Because the state of China said that he was inciting subversion of state power. His crime? Simply standing firmly on the principle of freedom of conscience and a refusal to let the state government limit the gospel. Take Brazil. A single judge in the nation of Brazil just this summer banished the platform X from the country, imposing fines of thousands of dollars on anyone who dared to access it. Why? Because the judge wrote in his opinion he was afraid that X might negatively influence the election by favoring one political group over the other. I think that's what elections are all about, right? But even in Western countries today, we're seeing this censorship trend. Take Adam Smith Connor, a military veteran and father who was prosecuted for thought crimes in the UK. Why? Because he violated a law that created a buffer zone around abortion clinics. And he simply stood there and silently prayed, without speaking a word, without holding a sign, silently prayed. And for that, he was prosecuted and convicted of a thought crime. What about in Australia? This is Billboard Chris. Billboard Chris, as you can see, likes to wear sandwich boards protesting gender ideology. He's a Canadian dad of 2. The E-Safety Commission in Australia ordered X to drop and banish one of his posts. What did the post say? It simply retweeted a Daily Mail article that explained some of the very inappropriate conduct that was being engaged in by a man who had recently been appointed by the WHO to its panel of experts on global transgender policy, a man named Teddy Cook. That was considered inappropriate by the government of Australia. Or what about Belgium? This is my colleague, Paul Coleman, standing in the background. The National Conservatism Conference held a conference in Brussels just this past spring. And the government of Belgium, the mayor of Brussels, forced 2 hotels to cancel the contracts for the convention. The third refused to bend the knee. And so what did the mayor do? Ordered in police to block the entrance to the conference. These are the police officers that were sent by the mayor to block the conference. What was the crime of the national conservatism movement? Well, in the words of the government, they were engaging in Eurosceptic ideas such as opposing legalization of abortion and opposing same-sex unions. That's why they had to be blocked and shut down. Now, ADF represents, in some way, all of the folks that I just talked about. But is that happening today? Is that happening today in the United States? Set aside the Western countries. What about the United States? Are we experiencing the censorship trend here?